So much for watching that incredible film with me. And on this night that we've lost one of our greatest heroes, it's my honor to bring before you three women who are heroes in their own right. First, I want to introduce to you Erika Cohn, Emmy Award-winning and Peabody Award-winning director who brought us this incredible and urgent film. She is joined by one of the women you met in the film, a godmother of this work, who did this work with Justice Now, Cynthia Chandler, who's the director of the Bay Area Legal Incubator, with my gratitude for all the work you've done, Cynthia, and the mother you are. And finally, but not least, Kirsten West Savali, executive producer of Essence.com, but as we call her, the Ida B. Wells of our time. It is my honor to introduce you to this panel and remind you that if you have any questions, to please type them into the YouTube chat, and know that there will be an encore showing of this special private screening given to us so generously by Erika Cohn. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. First and foremost, we do want to acknowledge the life and death of the legendary, the groundbreaking trailblazer, Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, a champion for women's rights on the Supreme Court, who passed away today at the age of 87. We send our condolences to her family and loved ones and all she touched. And we just want to honor her for one moment with a moment of silence. Thank you. And now, just as Justice Ginsburg would do, we're going to speak up, we're going to speak out, and we're going to make it plain about issues that, of course, were close to her heart and close to this work that we all are so passionate about. Belly of the Beast, so much of it. I want to thank you all, Erika and Cynthia, for your work. And so much of it is centered on reproductive justice and transformative justice, particularly for Black, Brown, Indigenous women who are locked in these cages. We are in a society right now where we have police officers that are killing us, gunning down our children in the streets. Then you have them criminalizing parents in these conditions that a white supremacist society created, a society that hates women, hates Blackness, hates poverty. So today we have families that have been ripped apart with precision, right? And this kind of vicious consistency, not just our families, but our bodies. So Representative Ilhan Omar said forced sterilization is a hallmark of genocide and internationally recognized by the UN as a crime against humanity. We need a full reckoning with the torture and cruelty inflicted by this administration and who all are complicit in it. So I want to start now recognizing Nurse Dawn Wooten. I want to turn to you first, Erika. You issued the following statement: the Belly of the Beast film stands in solidarity with the immigrant women under ICE custody at ICDC, who were coercively sterilized, in addition to the courageous nurse whistleblower who came forward. What were your first thoughts when you heard this news?
Thank you so much, Kirsten, and thank you, first of all, for setting the stage, and to A New Way of Life for hosting this incredible opportunity for us to be in discussion about the film. You know, I've spent the past decade examining the human rights abuses, including forced sterilization, in California's women's prisons as both a volunteer legal advocate and as a filmmaker, and have experienced the extreme levels of secrecy and privacy that these institutions hide behind, which make it incredibly difficult to uncover abuses of power and state-sponsored violence. And so forced sterilization is genocide. And the legacy of forced sterilization in the United States is deeply rooted in white supremacy. We need accountability for these eugenic practices, justice for the survivors, and safeguards to prevent future abuses. And so this is really, you know, what I thought about was how eerily similar these new stories work with the stories that we reveal in Belly of the Beast, and so similar to the stories that we have heard throughout the history of the United States with forced sterilization.
Going back to Representative Omar's words, about needing a full reckoning under this administration, but we know it's not just this administration, as you just touched upon. From fiscal years 2005 to 2006 to 2012, 2013, the state audit found that the state of California sterilized women without proper consent, the last being in 2011. As you discuss in your documentary, California banned forced sterilization in 1979 and still discontinued. This too is genocide. So does your research align with those numbers? And do you think incarcerated women face unprecedented dangers now under this administration, particularly with the passing of Justice Ginsburg?
I will say that those numbers are not actually indicative of what we found. We found that 1,400 people were sterilized in California's women's prisons between 1997 and 2013. And there were sterilizations, questionable sterilizations from 2014 and on that we're still looking into. And because of the levels of secrecy and privacy these medical institutions, our criminal justice system hide behind, it's very difficult for people who are currently in prison to be able to get this message out. And so that's where the work of Cynthia Chandler comes in, and I'll let her speak more to that.
Yes, please, Cynthia.
Okay, there, I got myself unmuted, sorry. When I heard about the sterilizations in the immigration detention center, I paused for a moment, not because it was surprising, but because one has to spend some time thinking about the work that eugenics does. Like, what is making eugenics so unchallengeable? Like, what is making it so entrenched in our society that, we can go through World War II and the shames of the Nazi regime and still cling to eugenics, that we can have a massive civil rights victory in 1979 where we get federal regulations that make it so every state has to undo their eugenics laws, and we still have eugenics where we're talking, our leaders in this country right now are talking publicly about being willing to sacrifice elders, communities of color, and medically vulnerable people to an epidemic, not to save us from the epidemic, but to save the white dominant economy, right? What's making it so intractable? And I think that it's because white supremacy is so at the root of so many of our institutions, and that includes the family, right? It includes who has the power to choose how, when, and whether to have children, to have a legacy, to have a future. And if we don't start challenging white supremacy at its core, we're just going to replicate these things over and over. And I also think that eugenics is fundamental to the work of white nationalism and fascism. And it should be seen as such, that what's really happening is the promulgation of a master race. And that when I first started seeing all this stuff happening in California, it was like, what's going on? California is usually the leader in reform, and what's going on with its backward criminal justice practices. But really what we were doing is heralding in a rise of neo-fascism, which is really sad and shocking.
It's interesting because so many people, when we talk about Nazis, and it's one of the myths this nation kind of tells about itself, right? That we somehow got our evil and our violence from them, versus that they looked to the United States, to what we were doing, or this country, not we, put the power and the blame where it belongs, to where the state, what they were doing to vulnerable women in this country. And so many parallels can be drawn in this moment between the Mississippi appendectomies, between the 1920s and 1980s. 14-year-old Elaine Riddick in North Carolina, who was forcibly sterilized in 1968. There was an article in the Boston Globe that says the US government admitted to at least 3,406 non-consensual sterilizations of Indigenous women between 1973 and 1976. So I want to talk about when we talk about eugenics, there's also kind of this dysgenic nature of our healthcare, our welfare, and our tax systems that leads conservatives to kind of implement eugenics into a capitalist system. And we spoke about this a little bit earlier, Erika, where on one side, you have to fight for access to abortion. And on the other, we have to fight against the violence of forced sterilization. And what it comes down to is any way possible, they try to strip away when and where and under what circumstances Black women in particular, Indigenous women, Latinx women, other women become mothers. So in the course of this work, how difficult has it been for you all to kind of fight back against the stereotypes and stigmas that surround these women?
Erika, is it okay if I jump in? From the beginning, when we first started, when I first met Kelly, and I met Kelly Dillon, literally met Kelly, having to tell Kelly that she had been sterilized without her knowledge, which is a grotesque way to meet another human, and no two humans should ever meet that way. From that moment forward, as we started looking at this issue and finding more and more people who are sterilized, I started doing lobbying trips because folks inside can't do those lobbying trips, right? And over and over and over again, what I would hear from leaders in our state was this attitude of, well, those women don't really want to have those children, do they? I mean, those women wouldn't really want to be having so many children. Aren't we really helping them? Isn't this really beneficial? And maybe we shouldn't even approach this issue, because if we were to challenge these coercive sterilizations, maybe we're limiting women's choices, their reproductive health care choices. And it was this incredibly entitled, white supremacist, paternalistic approach towards women and their motherhood. And what was very clear is that motherhood was not seen as something that Black women and Latinx women should ever be entitled to. They're just not at all entitled to it. And in fact, they were too deficient to have that privilege. And it was grotesque. And I want to just remind everybody that this was happening in California. This was happening in conversations with women who were in the Legislative Women's Caucus. We have yet to get accountability, and the exposure of these abuses when it became very public. That was Kamala Harris, who was our Attorney General. This was not with a Republican leadership. This was with dominant liberal leadership, and the complete devaluation of Black motherhood specifically.
Yeah, I think from a filmmaking perspective, even though Justice Now had worked on this issue for nearly a decade before Corey Johnson began his investigation with the Center for Investigative Reporting, I mean, that work really thrust this issue into a national conversation in a way that it hadn't been. It was like people couldn't ignore it anymore. And from a funding perspective, from a filmmaking perspective, it was as if CIR's reporting provided a legitimacy and an urgency that many people didn't have prior to, even though there were hundreds of testimonials of what was going on inside. And so for audiences, one of the things that was really important for me in making the film was that we as an audience are understanding, and kind of the layers of the onion are being peeled back as Cynthia and Kelly, like chronologically, actually what happened in the course of the film. You see the discovery between Cynthia and Kelly, and then we go back through the history of eugenics through Corey's reporting, kind of giving the audience that context in the way that, from a filmmaking perspective, I had to do to get the support for the making of the film.
I wanted to say, the activist community had a really hard time dealing with this issue too. And it brought up not just racism, but also misogyny within the leftist activist community. No one really even knew what eugenics was. We had a whistleblower in our situation who came forward with the minutes of this meeting from the Gender Responsive Strategies Committee of the Department of Corrections, where they were looking at the cost efficacy of sterilization. We had a whistleblower who came forward, who came to me personally because that person knew I'd been looking at these sterilizations. And that whistleblower didn't even have the language, unlike, the nurse now, didn't have the language to even say what made it wrong. So the whistleblower came to me and was like, this was being discussed and it just doesn't feel right. But even that whistleblower didn't have the language to talk about eugenics and to talk about women's reproductive rights. So it took, honestly, for the first 5 years of our effort of about 20, this has been a 20-year effort. If I wanted to get men, and this included Black men in the movement, to really take this seriously, I had to frame it in terms of it rendering women rapeable rather than women not being able to be mothers, right? So even within our own movement, the way that women's bodies were respected in the heart and was came more from a place of chivalry and again paternalism rather than a place of wanting to empower and value women's motherhood.
That's really interesting because I think about, you mentioned misogyny and having the language, and I think about those issues when we think about slavery and the way that it hasn't gone away, but that it's shape-shifted, right? There are different ways that slavery shows up, if not absolutely the same in different nations and different communities, but a different version of it. And with slavery, right, it's not just about white supremacy. It was predicated upon the rape of Black women to perpetuate it. Rapes were taking place. And so we know that white supremacy is a feminist and womanist issue because this kind of painful systemic oppression has been mapped on the bodies of Black women. And also when we talk about the difference between the GOP and Republicans versus Democrats, so much of this, the carceral state, the drug war, in which Black women are primary targets, can be laid at the feet of the Democratic Party as well, right? So it's not just simply that the pain that Black women experience is adjacent to what Black men experience. We're actually being victimized by the state. And this is what happens when you pathologize us as Black mothers, as unstable mothers, as unworthy mothers, which leads me back to the title of you all's film, Belly of the Beast. And I thought about that when I saw it because around 2011, there were billboards that said the most dangerous place for African-American children is the womb. And when I saw your title, was that intentional to kind of subvert that kind of dangerous anti-Black messaging when you all thought about it? Erika?
The title came from an incredible activist, Kanoa, who's a trans man at CCWF, and literally described CCWF as the belly of the beast. And that was echoed by so many people. And in describing, what this was made in collaboration with people inside, and in describing, what do you think about this potential title? What do you think about, belly of the beast? There were so many conversations and discussions that came from the title, that came from that initial conversation with Kanoa, that we knew that we had kind of resonated with the title, which is so hard to kind of sum up all of the issues that we describe in this film in one phrase. So that's how it initially came to be.
Cynthia, what are your thoughts when we think about Belly of the Beast and we think about how the wombs of Black women have been vilified and criminalized and forcibly sterilized? What are your thoughts about the power in that messaging?
So I think for me, I tend to think about the fundamental elements of slavery. I draw from Orlando Patterson? I know he's a sociologist from Harvard. I'm sorry, I'm getting his name wrong. It's totally a menopausal moment for me. I keep losing names. But anyway, he talks about the history of slavery, there being three primary components of systems of slavery. One of them is controlling people by force, which obviously we have inside prisons. I would argue that we have that on the streets, and that's part of what police violence is about too. We also have gross degradation of people who are in prison and the collateral consequences of people coming out. I would extend that out to communities of color and the grotesque degradation that folks are experiencing on a day-to-day. But the third element, rather than commodifying people and thinking about the belly, let's say, as the producer of future slaves, is called natal alienation, which is the control over whether or not the enslaved community has the ability to have connections to its kin in the past its lineageship ties in the current present, and whether or not it is able to have a future generation, right? The complete control, the commodification, yes, but the ultimate control over an entire future, and the potential extinction of an entire community. And to me, that's one of the most important reasons to look at the experience of people in women's prisons and detention centers and other total institutions, is that's where you can most primarily see how that natal alienation takes place within the context of slavery and the complete control. So for me, the belly of the beast has all these multiple meanings. Yes, it's at the sort of the heart of the prison itself, which I think Kanoa wanted to talk about. It is also totally about this play on how the belly is seen as both the place of birth, but also danger and destruction and death in terms of the stereotypes of Black women. And it's about the removal of that control. And hopefully our film does take that control back, and is part of the first steps to change that, right? To give back to communities more power, communities of color more power over having a future.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think about, Governor Jerry Brown, who, signed the bill that bans prisons from sterilizing incarcerated people without their consent, but it had been banned already since 1979, right? So the idea of silence as violence, how much complicity are we looking at right now where that kind of violence, institutional violence, can continue to happen for decades before people blow the whistle like that? Cynthia?
I think that, we can just look at what's happening on day after day after day of police murders and see that if we don't have real systems of accountability, if we don't have systems which take people seriously when they're harmed, which provide safety when people are harmed, and which create opportunity for atonement and apology and reformation of whole systems, if we don't have that, right, then we're doomed to continually repeat it. And that's what's happening with state violence, both outside on the streets and happening with state violence in prison. And so I think, if we don't find ways to be really accountable, we're done for. And I have to say that, Erika brought up the fact that these sterilizations may be continuing in California. Part of that sunshine law that we were able to get passed, part of what it did is it requires the Department of Corrections to post data on the sterilizations that they do forever on. And they have to disaggregate it by race and by age of the person that's sterilized, and also provide information on why the people are sterilized. I went through that data last week because it's not my job anymore. And I've passed the torch on to another generation of people who are awesome doing this work. But so I went and I looked at the data, and on its face, there's at least 5 sterilizations in the last 3 years. They're on their face, publicly listed, that do not fit the criteria for a legal sterilization. So I don't doubt that this is continuing. And it's continuing because we have not dealt with the issue of white supremacy and state violence at its root. And there hasn't been accountability.
Yeah, adding to that, eugenics is alive and well, and we are witnessing systemic racism and population control through policing, through imprisonment, through the immigration detention system, through lack of access to healthcare. And I really believe if we hold our institutions accountable and state actors who have committed harm, we hold them accountable, we can prevent future abuses from happening. And I think we're literally at the precipice of creating lasting change, but we first have to confront our eugenics history so that we can prevent a new genocide from occurring.
Interesting, because I think about how this system will criminalize the body, will shackle the body, Black women. They will do all these things to control us, as opposed to looking at the system that really needs to be broken, right? People talk about a broken system, and we have to push back against that, because we know the system is absolutely not broken. It's functioning exactly as it was intended to function. It's killing who was intended to kill, it's caging who was intended to cage. How do we break this system? How do we begin the work of breaking this system?
Eric and I are probably both smiling because it's like my mantra. I'm like, I really believe that we all have the power to make change happen. And I hope that this movie is way beyond a story of around a little group of people somewhere in California challenging sterilization abuse. Instead, it's an example of how people can cross over all different kinds of barriers and different experiences in life and come together and persevere and make change, right? And that, you know, we're the last one standing and therefore we're going to win. Okay. So I think, you know, what I always say, I challenge folks to do after watching this film is really look around you, think about one concrete thing you can do where you're challenging white supremacy in your community. For me as a white woman speaking to white folks who might be watching this right now, especially white people, it is our responsibility to undo white supremacy because we are the people benefiting from it and keeping it there. Right? So it's like, find something to do. I don't care how small it is or how big it is, and do it. And if you want one little thing, if it would help you, you can go to bellyofthebeastfilm.com. We have a petition that folks can sign to help us get reparations, as well as to notify people who are sterilized that they were in fact sterilized, and to try to create some level of accountability in California. If that's your one step, sign it. But also get folks to watch the film, but take it beyond that, wherever you see white supremacy in your community.
Erika, what are your thoughts?
I would echo everything that Cynthia said. In addition to signing the petition on our website, we have a list of partner organizations that people can support and choose to volunteer or sign up for more additional information. Please join our newsletter, bellyofthebeastfilm.com. We can keep you updated on all the things that are going on with the reparations movement and the process of holding state actors accountable. Host a screening of Belly of the Beast in your community, share the trailer, spread the word, really connecting the dots of the history of eugenics, the history of forced sterilization in this country with this trailer.
Absolutely. I wanted to also touch on that you all worked on a reparations package, correct? I saw that mentioned in the film. Can you tell us a little bit about the status of that and what's going on there?
Sure. So that actually references the petition I just mentioned. For 3 years now, we've been working with the California Coalition for Women Prisoners, California Latinas for Reproductive Justice, and also the Disability Rights and Education Fund to win reparations for people who are historically sterilized under older eugenics laws in California, as well as the contemporary sterilizations in California's prisons, and also to force the Department of Corrections to actually notify people that they sterilized, that they were in fact sterilized, because we suspect most people don't even know, which is another form of extreme state violence in and of itself. The bill also would request that the state issue a public apology. I mean, what we're trying to do is ensure that that there's a real sort of bite to the consequences, that there's some kind of true consequence, so that state actors watch this and maintain a sense of history and knowledge, right? So that it's unlikely to reoccur. And as you pointed out before, this was already illegal, and yet it keeps bubbling up. We got to do something to make sure it doesn't bubble up so much. We've lost the bill so far, clearly because of a sense of it costing too much money to do reparations, or why it's also difficult, right? Most of the people who are impacted, who we know of, are in prison, the contemporary survivors, and they can't go and lobby on their own behalf. And so legislators don't necessarily feel that it's a pressing issue if someone isn't right there telling them that they themselves were personally impacted. And that's why we really need folks to sign the petition. We need to show them that there's a swell of people in California who care about this issue and who want to ensure that there's truly state accountability.
Thank you for that. You talked about privilege beginning of the film, and one of the questions I was curious about and interested in learning from you all is that you showed up in this moment and kind of unburied these stories about women that this nation often leaves for dead. What have you learned? What have you both learned or unlearned throughout this process about freedom, about dignity, about abolition? How does this process change you? Erika.
I'll start. So I would like to just take a step back and tell you the story of how I got connected to this, because I think that that's important. When I first learned about the work that Justice Now was doing, the Let Our Families Have a Future campaign, which talked about the many ways that prisons destroy the basic human right to family, one of the most heinous being the illegal sterilization, that hit home for me as a Jewish woman growing up in Salt Lake City nearly 25 years ago. The phrase "never again" was always in the back of my mind. And this screamed eugenics, this screamed genocide. And 10 years ago, when we began this film, I was not a well-known filmmaker. I was, Cindy likes to call me a baby filmmaker, learning a lot about the process, investing in a movement that I was deeply drawn to and deeply passionate about. Educating people on the legacy of eugenics. And I think throughout the process, as a filmmaker, as an artist, I've grown. I understand that I can't document a particular community's work like this without being embedded. And I also understand that the power of storytelling in placing some of that control and collaboration in the hands of the people who are most impacted and a part of this work is critically important. And so that's what we did in Belly of the Beast. This is a collaboration with people inside. This is a little bit atypical, atraditional of how a filmmaking process would work. And I've learned that that really, truly is the only way to tell these impactful stories, to create change and challenge white supremacy.
I guess I'd like to say that, I've grown up doing this work. My mentors have been jailhouse lawyers who are fighting for their own survival. They certainly weren't other typical lawyers. There are people who are inside. And also, I've been a prison abolitionist, although I didn't have the language for it until I was older. Since I was 8 years old, I was part of a Scared Straight program. When I was 8 years old, I lived in a segregated town in the Midwest, and I lived in a small enclave that was allowed to be integrated. And some community elders, I think they were scared and wanted to make sure that we really understood, how we were supposed to behave as good white supremacists. And so they sent my classroom, my 4th grade classroom, into a Scared Straight program at a maximum security juvenile facility where every child who was caged was Black. And the extreme abuse that those children experienced in front of us, combined with my Black classmates experiencing, was so shocking that I didn't have the language to explain what in theory made it wrong. What I knew was wrong was that I could no longer really trust the adults in my home and in my community to solve what was obviously a horrible, horrible situation. And instead of birthing a white supremacist, they birthed an abolitionist. So I've been fighting for abolition ever since. And my approach to this whole topic, and frankly, the founding of Justice Now as an organization and making sure that people in women's prisons were part of the leadership from the beginning, and eventually transitioning my role on to formerly imprisoned people to run the organization and people inside, was that I think it's so important for the abolitionist movement not to be academic and theoretical, but to open its arms to people who are in prison, not even just formerly in prison, but people in prison, and specifically people in women's prisons who have such a wealth of knowledge about what it means to survive violence that is never acknowledged when there is no safety, and yet are serving disproportionately long sentences for nonviolent offenses. And so I think they're an incredibly important community to inform transformative justice discussions, and should be the leaders of the abolitionist world. So my work has been around figuring out how to amplify the strategies and views of folks on the inside, and literally everything I know about dignity and survival and resilience in the face of extreme hardship I've learned from my comrades inside, who are really my teachers.
Thank you all so much. We could have this conversation all night. I appreciate you all taking the time. I want to leave us with some thoughts from the Combahee River Collective that if Black women are free, it would mean that everyone else would have to be free, since our freedom would necessitate the destruction of all the systems of oppression. Thank you all so much for joining us here, and you all have a great night.